Now we're rolling.
Okay, good. Welcome, everybody. Okay, so I wanted to raise another aspect to this question of parousia and also the way in which it creates a certain form of materiality. So that's I'm hoping that's where we are today, and I want to bring it into the question of blockchain derivatives and also the question of futures. And I'm hoping that this connects to what Lauren in particular did last week, but I want to lay it open as a possibility to discuss, and then we will get into the seminar, because I just want to throw this out as as something to consider. The question becomes how to think true and truth and objectivity without resurrecting metaphysics, basically. Is that possible? I had a long debate with Daniel Rubenstein. In fact, it came to blows, because his view is that, and I love Daniel, but his view is that there's no way to talk about truth without bringing in metaphysics. Now, the question becomes, A, is that true? And B, if it is true, why is that a problem? Why should it be a problem to bring in metaphysics? And if it isn't true, how does one speak about this thing called truth without lapsing into a metaphysical moment? And I'll preface this by saying I think that the latter, the last part, is where I am personally going with my work, and where you may be going with your work, and where I think Foucault was going with his work. Hence why we're looking at all of this. And the person who has pioneered a lot of this has died today, or this morning, in early hours, Stephen Hawkins, who has made the many contributions, obviously, but one of the major ones was rethinking set theory. And when one understands how set theory operates in physics, and theoretical physics in particular, one can get a sense of this different form of materiality that escapes metaphysics. I'll circle back to that in a second, but I'd also like to just thank Stephen Hawkins for being alive and for all the work he did. It's quite incredible. Okay, now, I have mentioned this before, and I'm going to raise it again now more formally, and it's what I call the problem of the Greek debt. And this is a euphemistic way of expressing this. I think that we're in a time period right now where, because of the circulation of information, both at a data loan or data environment, the question of the derivatives, the question of how blockchains operate, there is a different power structure that is getting formulated. And this power structure is a power structure that operates at the level of a circulation of slices of information that break away from fully formed, coherent aspects, and that you're only ever dealing with a fractalized slice, with a slice of something which can cohere to something else, and that coherence creates a kind of economy, a kind of circulation, a kind of materiality that is redefining the world as we know it, basically. And why I call it the Greek debt is because of the example that I've given you many times, but I'll give it again just to put it in context. When I was involved with people at MIT who were finishing their MBAs, and these were CEOs who were head of major corporations in the world, and they'd done an MBA, so it was a very specific kind of MBA for people already successful in making billions, millions, and so on and so forth. This was the kind of MBA degree that they were giving. we went around the table, and I think I've said this to you before, we went around the table and said, what was the most expensive thing you've ever bought? And people said Maserati car, or, you know, a house, or whatever, you know, world trip. And someone bought the Greek debt. And then they sold the Greek debt. And in the moment that they bought and sold the Greek debt, the buying and selling of the debt was a buying and selling of futures. And I need you to get a sense of this idea. So the future never arrives, and it never doesn't arrive. It hovers. And the hover of this thing called the futures is the debt. Now, the people who are responsible for the debt, i.e. in this case, the Greeks, still have the debt. The fact that the debt is passed over and something positive, like let's say money, a profit comes out of that debt, is not irrelevant, but not relevant to people in the situation who own the debt. So the debt is owned or is foisted upon people, but that debt is not held. That debt is not able to be accounted for. Now, Foucault speaks about the debt that Socrates mentions with Asclepius. And he says in his, whatever chapter that was in. 6, yeah, thank you. He says in chapter 6 that Socrates says to Crito, remember to thank Asclepius, which you're not supposed to say unless there's been some sort of, I don't know, healing going on or something like that, because a cock is always paid, or in this case it was always paid, as a retribution for a debt that was solved, a debt that was passed on. And Foucault gets into this whole question of what is this debt? What is the question of the debt that Socrates was passing on, that he was somehow thanking Asclepius for? And then there's been interpretations, well, you know, he was trying to kill himself, or I don't know, he was an unhappy person, or finally he didn't have to deal with the truth any longer.
Life is a disease.
Life is a disease, of the Nietzschean formulation of it. And Foucault says, no, I don't think that's the case. And he looks at Diogenes, and he says that actually what Foucault starts to develop is this notion of an ethical community that is formulated at the level of a circulation that's going on. Now just park that, and let's return to the Greek debt. At the moment, the Greek debt side of this argument is that one can't own, well, no, one has to be responsible for the debt, but they don't own the debt. Those who own the debt, or anyway, those who engage in the debt, but maybe don't own it at the same level, it's a different form of ownership, those that are able to sell the debt on, manage not to be burned by that debt, manage not to be harmed by the debt. They only get something out of the debt, which is more money in this case, billions in the Greek debt. And this is true for all.
They get something out of the ownership of the debt.
Well, it's not the ownership of the debt, it's the ownership of the futures.
Yeah, so they get it out of the.
They're betting on the market going up or down.
But
Yeah,
it's,
the
I thought it was
forecast.
interesting because
But
they're not getting it out of the debt. Like
No,
they're getting it out of
the hover.
The hover.
The hover. Now,
The what?
the hovering, it's hovering around
Hovering.
like a hovercraft.
Okay, right.
Yeah, so in order to understand how that's operating materially, one needs to get, I mean, apart from it would be very helpful if you knew financial markets and you knew how the stock market operates or any of these other things, but you don't have to go there. You can just stick with the Socratic circulation, or you can stick with how Foucault is talking about parousia in this case. Because the parousia is the Greek debt, is what's being suggested here. It's something that can be passed on. And but only certain people or certain entities can pass it on. Now, the way Foucault is talking about this, there's an ethical positivity about it. There's an ethical community that gets born out of it. The way it happens in the technosphere is that the people that don't care about it, or that don't, that there's not an ethic, there's an anti-ethics or an amoral, amorality to it. There's a gluttony to it. So I'm raising this, I'm putting this on the table for you to consider. This notion of circulation, this notion of the way in which something hovers, this notion of the hovering of something being objectively true. I want to use words like true. I want to use words like objective. And I don't think that it's reinstating in metaphysics by going in that direction. So, last piece of the puzzle. If it's true that parrhesia can swing both ways, can be as much a petrol technosphere move as it can be, you know, the person who, I don't know, bears their soul and it stands in the line of fire and gets shot and killed in order to produce a position, is irrelevant in this example. What's relevant is that it exists, that a different form of truth exists, a different form of materiality exists that can only be understood in this fractalized circulation. So that it has an ethical component to it is like the second step. There is no ethics up to that point, either way. It can, but to put it slightly differently, there is always ethics. It can't be removed from it. There's no ethics abstractly situated away from the circulation. To put it in those terms means that if you then call that parrhesiac move, that's a move where one understands how that debt gets transferred and can in fact transfer a debt. Knows how the game is played. Where are we with this? Did you follow me on this? Did you hear any of this? Yeah?
I have a question.
Okay.
I don't understand how you make this jump by arguing that circulation is this common thing between the Greek dead and the dead to Asclepius, and because of that calling parrhesia the Greek dead.
Yeah, I have the same
Like I don't.
question.
Okay.
Because
Why?
Yes, Dario. Yes, Johnny. Go on. Yeah.
Because there was like maybe in the first moment when you talk about let's stay with Asclepius, if you think you were healed and you owe something to Asclepius, it couldn't be someone else paying this debt, or you wouldn't be passing this debt on someone else. The normal truth or the way would be just to settle that debt. And in the moment when Foucault in this chapter 6, when they are talking about how that debt was settled, there's this moment that why was also Socrates owning the debt, even though he did not propose to escape from the prison and kind of resisted all these temptations. Why is he also still owe something to Asclepius? And then the moment comes where he, as a part of this community of the philosophers, of the people, that he, in a certain sense, also owes his debt.
Okay, I'm going to park that right there.
Okay.
I
Just-
didn't understand.
I'm going to try it this way because I think that you know the problem of identity politics, and you know people claiming to be queer, gay, whatever the long sentences. This is a way of thinking meaning or identity without resorting to an essentialism.
Mhm.
That instead what happens is that one inhabits the circulation as opposed to inhabiting what's being dumped on them. And so they're not speaking from a position of oppression, or speaking the true voice of the oppressed person. Instead, they're speaking in terms of the circulation.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
That makes
Yes.
sense, but not the Greek debt bit.
Just hold on.
Okay.
Okay, so, so if that's the case, then the Greek debt, which is something that is not, it is a euphemistic, well, it's not euphemistic because it exists as an actual debt that needs to be paid, but one doesn't actually own that debt, and one doesn't in fact not own that debt.
But I don't think that's actually correct. The Greek people, or the government on behalf of the Greek people, has gone to a cadre of institutions and has borrowed money. That set of institutions has lent the money based on their faith that they were going to be repaid, and the quantity of that faith is reflected in the interest rate that's attached to the debt. It's then securitized, and then the debt circulates according to people's people aren't benefiting from the debt. They've lent the money and they're getting repaid. I mean, they're benefiting by the interest rate, the cadre of individuals. That circulates between them as people lose interest in their faith in the Greek government, or on another party gains a bit, and that's what creates the circulation. The debt is a fixed amount that is changeable, because at certain times the Greek government repays it, and at other times they might want to borrow more. But I don't understand how this can have anything to do with truth or ethics. Apart from is it correct to borrow? Which is a kind of whole, it's sort of Islamic sort of
No, we're not going
theocratic
there.
argument.
Yeah.
But
You said
that is
Cleopatra argument.
Islamic.
Islamic, there's
Yeah.
Cleopatra, I thought.
But
Okay, Mattia?
but all we have is just a circulation of a security.
We're getting warmer, but okay, yes.
I was thinking, I understand what you're saying, but perhaps I am understanding what John is saying a bit too metaphorically, and I'm trying not to. But for the problem of the debt, going from the financial Greek debt to the debt in an economy of sense,
Yeah.
I am thinking of the fact that the debt itself, the money owed, that's never repaid. That is the distance that is open in order to have the economy circulating.
Mm-hmm.
It is a bit like those mortgages where one only repays the interests and never the initial sum.
Endowment order, yeah.
Exactly. And then the trust or the faith in the ability to repay, which is what is traded, and that hovers around on a plus and minus the zero, which would be we trust you to repay exactly everything on time or before or after that.
So it hovers around 100%.
It was around 100, yeah. And that's, I understand it in this way. So then the circulation is precisely the fact that, because repaying the initial lump sum would be the total closure of metaphysics.
Right. And why is that the case?
Because one it would be a dialectical solution of solving entirely the problem and getting to the beginning and end at the same time. It's an absolute rule. It's a circle around everything. Nothing is left after that.
Mm-hmm.
While in this case we have something that, although it is not the always already lost of the Derridean trace or all that, has opened a distance, and we are trading upon the tension that this generates.
Mm-hmm.
So that is, as far as I can get, that.
Okay, let's keep that there, so
and
we
economy.
get one piece of the puzzle.
And then I would add another thing regarding
Okay.
objectivity, which perhaps goes in the direction of the identity politics, but we'll take part. I think that it is possible to have truth without metaphysics, insofar as there are moments where things we know, doesn't matter if they're right or wrong, enter in contradiction, and there is no passage there. And those become moments, reference points. One knows that that's not possible, so moves back from that and starts reorienting. And that is something that I would like to develop into a pinpoint for objectivity.
Okay, so, wait a second, Dario?
I would also like to absolutely agree with this absolute closure, because if we think of saving that happened like a year or two ago of Greeks, that was not the saving of Greeks, but the saving of circulation, because it was not the Greeks who were saved, because they still owe the same money, but it was the Western banks whose trust, so if the Greeks defaulted, they would have lost the money. Not the Greeks never had the money.
So let's just see if we've got what we've got on the table. The first thing on the table is the question of metaphysics, and from what Mattia is saying, that notion of metaphysics that's being challenged is when truth is presented in a somehow closed environment. Now, we know that people like Adorno, for example, have always made the argument that an object cannot go into its contradiction without leaving a remainder. And that remainder, that thing that's remaining, is what gives it its truth, which is his whole attack against Hegel's movement on, and even Marx for that matter. So the negative dialectic, in negative dialectics, where he talks about this excess, and the notion of excess as part of a whole iconography of what is truth has played with and against art, identity politics, whatever this thing, this excess, whatever that is. So it doesn't go, somehow there's a remainder or a trace or something.
Or an interest rate.
Or an interest rate.
Interest payment.
And that's a very specific model, as it were, a very specific framework, which doesn't mean it's not real. It just means that one's taking on a metaphysical paradigm to explain its truth functions. But if there is actually a way to think about truth that doesn't fall into the category of excess, or if it has something that resembles this thing called excess, because it's not fitting into the structure, it's not fitting into the whole, so it's neither part of the totality, nor is it outside of the totality, so it's somehow involved, somehow hovering, involved with this thing, then the question becomes, what is the thing that is hovering? What is the thing that is the excess but not an excess to the totality? And that, for Foucault, is the circulation. And it's the way in which something circulates. The question becomes, how does something circulate if it doesn't have any endpoints, or, it's like, how does that operate? And he develops in this, I feel like I'm revealing the underbody of this story, but.
Oh, thank God.
Stop it. Anyway, so the first thing on the table is to understand the metaphysics, the way in which one uses the term metaphysics when one talks about truth as being a closed system, or that the system has something like the in-between. That's still a metaphysics. So if you talk about transgender, for example, as being the in-between of male and female, that this would still be a metaphysical way into understanding truth. So the in-between doesn't exist in objective reality. There's no in-between. There's no deep cut. That brings in an entire paradigm that enables a whole different way of understanding reality, which may or may not be the case. But it does mean, for example, that one can take on positions about speaking the truth from a subject positionality, which is an attack. Sorry, I'm probably saying something that sounds cryptic. The problem with identity politics, the good news and the bad news about identity politics is the same news, which is that there is oppression against people, there is nastiness against people, women, people of color, gay, Jew, whatever the group is, and you can have 17 different oppressions and so on and so forth. That's one form of the identity politics, and that was what, let's say, queer tried to absolve or dissolve or something like that. Now, That doesn't mean that there isn't racism, misogyny, homophobia, and all the different lists that are going on, but it does mean that if one, like, for example, last night we had Dickie Bowe doing what I thought was an absolutely amazing thing on lip syncing. And what he did on the lip syncing is that he was a drag queen, he was Kenneth Williams, then he was this woman from the 1990s whose voice they heard as she started unfolding this whole thing on, it was really pretty much of a pornographic expression of wanting to have sex with this guy. And there was a discussion that happened afterwards. Despina brought up part of it, Cole brought up part of it. Could this white male speak from the position of being a female, having sex with this guy in all sorts of sexual positions? And there was a discussion on this. Now,
And in what way?
and in what way?
Because he said that he wanted to show the beauty of it. Do you think that he did?
Yes, I did.
No.
But I'm just saying.
Because when he said that, even his comment, like, yeah, but we can apparently see that this woman is of a certain age and doesn't have a specific experience in doing this, somehow he devalues her. And even the way that he performed, it made it a joke or something. Even his
Yeah.
outfit.
I did not see it that way, but the reason I was bringing it up was to say that, is it possible, maybe he didn't do it properly, but is it possible to shapeshift identities?
It is possible, but you have to do it with care.
Fine, I'm
So
just
is
saying,
anybody familiar with Victoria Sin?
yeah, Victoria Sin,
Mm.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up as well, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, because I wrote a paper for a conference that was about different forms of memes and stuff, and the way that people say, like, oh, me, when they use an image, and it's like a pointing outwards, but saying me at the same time,
Mhm.
which I think is really interesting. But then there's also this counter-argument which somehow kind of mimics this argument. There's a woman in America who wrote a very decent article about what she terms digital blackface, and she basically says that white users are kind of using images of black people, and they're performing a whole load of like emotional labour on the behalf of non-black users, basically. And is that right and is that wrong? And it just feels like a similar kind of argument. But I see the the real benefit in that kind of pointing outwards, but also facing in at the same time.
Were you there last night at the Dickie
No,
Bowe
unfortunately
thing?
not. I would have liked to have been there.
What was interesting for me about that, Catherine, you were there, right? What I thought was interesting was the way in which the pointing outward, as it were, so he was lip syncing, so he's pointing outward to the me that's out there, but also not out there. So he was the echo, he was the ghost, he was the this, he was that, he was the Hamlet, and so on and so forth that was going on. So it was a different form of how one positions the truth. And what did you think about the performance?
I thought it was amazing, and I had a different, Shannon and I talked about it this morning, but in terms of the woman's performance, I think that it was very naive perhaps on his part to want to show the world female desire. But I think he stumbled over his words. It was like the only time he did during the whole thing, when he was trying to show something that he knew nothing about. And I thought his saying that male desire dominates the sexual planet was a truism. And he may have done it less. I think he knew he was treading on difficult ground. But
So is there a thing called authentic female desire? Is there a thing called authentic male desire, black desire? See, we're talking about really knotty problems here. And all I'm saying is that to the degree to which there is, because maybe that's too strong a way of even asking the question, if one talks about this thing that is about the truth, and this is what's going on in a time period where it's kind of essential that we start stepping up to the plate with people like idiots like Trump and so on, that it seems to me that there must be a way to think about how something is true without putting into place stereotypes, something like that, yeah, to speak.
If you are implying that what I suggest requires a kind of authenticity, this is not the case. What I want to say is what I said before about the notion of care.
Okay.
He said that, okay, I know that I'm taking a difficult task, but in order to show that I'm not just adopting this and doing it, but I also put myself in a position of vulnerability and I give something as well, I put the thing in my throat, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
In my opinion, and for my, I don't know, maybe this is not for everybody, it wasn't enough. It wasn't vulnerable enough, and it wasn't naked enough. If he did it in another way, maybe I wouldn't I wouldn't see it that way or perceive it that way. So this is what I'm trying to say.
But you didn't feel that way when you did the Kenneth Williams thing?
No, because he embodied it differently. Maybe because he's a gay man, this enabled him to do it with bigger care.
But you see, and this is the thing, he raised the whole thing about the fact that he was a gay man, and he interpreted Kenneth Williams in a very flamboyant way.
Yeah.
But Kenneth Williams never was flamboyant like this.
Yeah.
And because Kenneth Williams is got a very flamboyant voice, and therefore could have these kind of like, really queenie kind of ways of behaving, he's allowed to get away with it because people read him, Dickie Bowe, as a gay man, and therefore he has the right, the authenticity, to speak on behalf of Queen gay.
No, I'm not saying
But
that.
Kenneth
though.
Williams wasn't a gay man.
Yeah.
Yes,
He
he
was
was.
asexual. I
Well,
thought he identified as asexual, and he was quite, and he never, because obviously the inference was that he was a gay man, and he said no, I'm not interested, and it was one of the sort of first people to kind of come up with the asexual identity, if you like.
In any
What-
case,
you were
whatever
gonna say something.
he was, the thing is that I don't know Kenneth Williams, I didn't know some of the references that,
Yeah.
that he had. I didn't need to know if he's gay or not. The thing is that what I saw on stage somehow made sense in all the other cases than the last one. Even the white powder that he put on his face, it seemed to me disrespectful, because it was like, if he did it in another way, maybe it would make sense, but it didn't. It's like me, for example, painting my skin black and trying to speak about people of color. I don't know if there's a way to do it. I cannot think of any way, actually, right now.
Okay, what are you gonna say, John?
No, nothing.
So what were you gonna say? Because I think I want to get to the meat of this, because to speak abstractly is not good enough. We really need to understand what is this Parisic move. Yeah.
To me, when you said earlier, we asked earlier before we introducing the Dick Bowe performance question, if there is an authenticity of being gay or woman or foreign or whatever. And the immediate reaction is no, but that's almost a presupposition we always move from, at least in this group. What I think is very important to keep in mind, or more than keeping in mind, and it has been my position as an artist, and I try to articulate it in my thesis, is that there might not be an authenticity or an identity or a metaphysical point, but the matter we have in hand is attention that thinks like that, or attention towards that. That's our dimension.
Say that again. Yeah, I'm not sure if people got that.
There might not be an authenticity, a metaphysical ground, a point, but the matter we have in hand is attention towards that, or a dimension that thinks in reference to that, even if it is distancing itself from it. And that to me has been the material of art. And that to me is the objectivity, or leads toward the notion of
So
objectivity.
this
we are aiming to.
distance, explain what you mean by this distance.
But not distance as in something is over there and I am over here, but I am immersed, embedded, part of, better, not immersed, because part of a way of thinking that thinks metaphysics, that thinks the ground, that thinks authenticity. And that is my matter. That is what I can use and I can distort. So the example of Digbo actually functions quite well. And precisely where it didn't work, to me, there is something extremely interesting to develop. I wasn't there, unfortunately, I'm marking too many essays. But it seems to me that precisely the fact that there is both an expectation or a presupposition of identity at one end of the segment and a challenging of identity at the other end of the segment, and one finds oneself on that segment is the matter one is working on. It is not defined in the dimensions within which one is. The segment is the material.
So let me throw this out to you while I'm thinking about it. Would you identify, would anybody in this room identify as an artist, as a philosopher? Let me just use those two. I mean, maybe you identify something totally different, or you don't even use those terms, but I'm just saying, does anybody feel comfortable calling themselves an artist?
Only when I do it.
Only
Like
when
when
you do
I
it.
materialize the thing. Like it's in the sense of like when I'm doing art, then I feel as an artist. But if I'm doing something else, then the feeling is not. I wouldn't. If I would say I'm an artist, it feels a little bit less authentic than when I'm really doing art.
So Stephen Hawkins, are we all comfortable calling him a physicist?
But I think it's a different thing.
Okay, good. What's the difference?
That in some sense, okay, this is difficult. In some sense, there's something that an artist and a philosopher in society, as it is supposed to carry, which is the ethical dimension of that society, and which is also the kind of being the exception of that society.
And is it putting words in your mouth to say that that thing that the artist stroke philosopher carries is a debt?
Well, I would say in this,
Not to lead the witness, but
I mean, I'm struggling with Foucault, and I'm struggling with the comparison, and I tell you why.
Okay.
Because I've just read this book by Kerstin Stockemeyer, which unfortunately is only in German, but she talks about
in English.
There are some parts of it. Anyway. Her main argument is she's an art historian, she's looking at art and she's looking to get rid of art. And the way she does this is by arguing that autonomous art is only a phase in the total history of human form giving, let's say. What we're particularly looking at the last 200 years of Western art history, which come out of a kind of Enlightenment, Renaissance, humanist kind of move to establish the subject as something that is contingent on three things that develop historically. One is a kind of nation state, a nationality and citizenship. The other one is gender being only possible as like a kind of two sexes, like male, female, and nothing else. And the third idea is the idea of freedom, which is essentially, there she's using the sort of Afro-pessimism argument to kind of basically say, if you have a world of slavery, then white freedom is always black unfreedom, so it's not really freedom. And these are the three things that art has been exceptionally asked to promote.
And been involved in somehow.
And been involved in somehow. And whenever art has fallen out of reproducing these three things in some way, it's been marginalized as pornographic, as criminal, as pathological.
So the kind of artists, and I mean, she uses a lot of Bataille to make this argument. She also uses like kind of more obscure people like Carl Einstein and Mertens. It doesn't matter, it don't have to be so geeky, but she's looking, she's looking at a range of artists who could be sort of artists and writers who could be in that argument. So she's looking at Kathy Acker, she's looking at, a huge group of people. It's a really interesting book. So in that sense, I would say what she manages to show is that, oh yes, you don't want to say you're an artist or a philosopher, because that means taking on the whole other baggage around the three terms, which you're supposed to, carry also. And in a sense, that is a debt, but maybe not the debt that we want to have. Okay.
So, if you swap the word debt for obligation, which you certainly could do in a financial market, then it perhaps makes a little bit more sort of directive sense.
Okay, getting there, but not yet there.
No, I want to say too many things at the same time.
Okay.
Regarding these, the point that you made, I think it is very interesting, because I've been thinking something that seems somehow spectral of that, is that ontology, at least from Heidegger, has taken on a very static position, because it is a contemplation of being detached from all other finalities, duties, obligations, responsibilities.
And that's what you mean by aesthetic contemplation?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So the Kantian aesthetic judgment is exactly the position Heidegger needs to put himself in order to be in relationship with being. And that, it's very, it's very interesting to develop as a commentary, but it's very problematic as a philosophical position. And what then I would, so this seems to be complementary to the book of Stekemaier, because if I am not putting myself in that aesthetic cleansed platform from which I can contemplate being, then, as I was saying before, I am always already, I don't like the expression, I am immersed, I'm part of a tension that is asking the question of truth, asking the question of objectivity, or dealing with the problem of a metaphysical endpoint, and that becomes what I need to work on. Recently I came up with an expression, daring practices rather than art, which seemed to me to explain better what I'm not able to do at the moment, but I'd like to do.
The funny thing is, so what she does is kind of an interesting move in a way. It's like she tries to say this is an anti-modern and an anti-systemic aesthetic. She calls it a formalism. And she says there is a kind of, there's a debordering that happens in art as it is and as we all know it, where it constantly opens up new areas for itself and expands. But this is it becomes less and less specific as it does so. And in that way it operates like the economy in general. Now, this kind of debordering that she suggests is not an idea that you can get beyond this particular set of problems, but that you can sort of open the, like with the Bataille thing, open the wound to the point where everything goes into the wound. And one example that she gives for that, for example, is this kind of fantastic German court document where they're banning one of Kathy Acker's books, Blood and Guts in High School, and they say she's not a feminist and this book is not emancipatory, precisely because the main character sort of gets abused all the way through the book and dies of cancer in the end and doesn't do anything to emancipate herself from that. So the critique happens by pulling everything into that hole and burying it, where then she would say on the basis of that you can see a network of works that have a sympathy
that could be an anti-systemic, anti-modern kind of network of things. But B, you could also see that they just simply refuse to reproduce things as they are, or to offer the comfort of a sort of like, we could do this and it could keep going a little bit longer, sort of in that way, because here's a political artwork, or sort of it's sort of with Bataille there's sort of this sense that everything has to be kind of destroyed. The interesting thing is what she brings in then is a long discussion also of derivatives and of futures and how that has impacted on the subject, because of course the sort of idea that we are free because we have ownership of ourselves as citizens, and in that way we're like the free laboring subject and also free in other ways, becomes more and more drawn into question, where the thing that makes the social synthesis, and not sure that, like, I would totally agree with that part of the argument, but she says it's always been work, and the fact that you can work, and this has sort of regulated and kept society together in that sense. But now that it's moved on to derivatives, and this is the main way of creating value now, like the humans and human work is so marginalized, and also we can see increasingly that our sort of bourgeois freedom is becoming more and more not something that we own, but as our pensions and our health insurance and all this kind of things get converted into, you know, financial kind of
blockchains,
chains, like really, this is becoming a debt, and this is becoming a kind of, this is actually taking this form of subject apart, if it wants to or not. So we would be closer to you, where we would say this can be a technosphere, petrosphere, whatever moment, or this can be an ethical.
I mean, I don't know if it's going to be either or quite like that, but
Yeah.
what I am suggesting, what I'm trying to throw out on the table to think through, is that I do not believe in the inevitability of fascism. That's what I'm actually saying. And that because I don't think it's just a belief, you know, it's that I don't want to believe it. I mean, it's like, you know, it's coming, but no. I actually think that one can still take the same tools, the same bullshit that's going on, in this case the derivatives market, and create a certain kind of Parisic response. Now, and that is partly because I think the Parisic response itself is about a debt economy. And that debt economy, in the olden days, which wasn't so long ago, under, let's say, first, second, and third wave feminism and different civil rights movements, that debt was carried by people who were political militants that were going on the street and whatever, and doing whatever. And now we still have these million people marches, 2 million people marches, and nothing changes, or very little changes, let's say. So, or 3 people go on a march and the whole thing changes. So something, the loci of power is in a different dimension than it normally has been. And the question is, what is that kind of thing that I think that Foucault is foregrounding in this text that we can look at and deal with, not because we're just so self-righteous, but because we use these terms all the time. Artist, philosopher, I do anyway. You know, and I'm okay about calling myself a philosopher. I used to go a long time without doing that because I just thought it was male or whatever it was. And then it annoyed me that every time anyone thought of philosophers, they always thought of men. And so it's just like, okay, we've got to work on this then. I will call myself a philosopher. I will call myself a poet, not a philosopheress or whatever the stupid thing is, or a professor or thing or something. And, you know, in fact, there's a thing on John Oliver, who's hilarious, by the way, side note. And John Oliver had a thing on last night called, where he was critiquing these things called sheroes. I don't know if you heard about this, which are heroes in the States with an S. And he goes, of course, there's also these things called heroes, which are in fact women. You don't even have to misspell it, you know, like this kind of thing. So I'm just the game that is played of pulling these names, these words, these Parisic moves, this is what I'm trying to get on the table. So just to recircle back to this. So the first thing we've got on the table is this metaphysics means the closure, means a ground. So we're at the same. So we're using the same terms to understand what we're talking about. So when you use metaphysics, you know that there's an implication of a ground of some kind, and a post-metaphysical move means to get rid of that ground. Basically, is the shorthand. Yeah, Dario, and then Despina, and then Catherine.
When you were talking about this, the markets and the derivatives, it's also interesting to see that when we think of Foucault, there this care of oneself, that the neoliberalist or a derivative move is that the market takes care take care of yourself and of us all. And it actually when we're talking about value, and it's basically the value isn't anymore relevant. There is no value in this sense. There is only price. So the market creates this price, and this is all there is, in a sense that that when we're talking also about the truth, and when you said the sentence, there can be millions marching on the street, but nothing changes. Nothing changes because the truth happens in sub-millisecond time. So
in a different circulation.
The different scale of the time. So I cannot change anything if I go on the street, but I can change something if I start to act also in sub-second.
But sometimes going on the street also changes.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So this. Yeah. Wait, Despina.
I get the overlapping of the concepts and why you're suggesting this with the Greek debt and Foucault's text.
Mm-hmm.
My objection has to do mostly with the use of the word parisia, because I have the sense that parisia requires certain protocols that I have the sense that in the market are not met. For example, a kind of intimacy. I have the sense that Foucault, when he says in the beginning of the book about monarchy, aristocracy or monarchy, that being closer somehow to the notion of parisia is because there is this kind of creating an encounter with less people, like the Parisiastic Pact cannot be a pact of 1 million people, I think. And this is why, for example, he gives the example of the person who is next to the emperor as the person who might create a Parisiastic moment.
Why can't it have 1 million people?
I don't know, I'm thinking about it. I have the sense, I might be wrong.
I don't know. It was a real question. I'm just curious, like how. It's like, how long is this piece of string? Like, how far can one go before it just doesn't work?
Because I have the sense from the text, at least now that we're discussing about it, that there is something important. For example, why Socrates goes in the city and finds individually people and talks to them, and doesn't go to the agora and talks to the whole city. That there is something about this more intimate relationship.
Yeah. Intensity will be different in one-to-one rather than one
But
to
it's a different
million.
technology, the dialogue in the street and the meme, the circulating things on the web. That's what one also needs to take into account.
Yeah, and what I want to say is that I have the sense that, of course, it seems that what you are raising has these interesting overlappings, but I'm just questioning the protocols, like the kind of encounters that are created, and also the notion of care and risk, like how this is manifested in your example. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, that's interesting. That's important.
What I think is important when you're thinking of derivative futures is that while it is essential that the left understands that this is the new technology of production and cannot keep asking to go back to the gold standard and measuring wealth on the production of the art industry. It's pathetic that they don't understand that. At the same time, no, it's irritating. I mean, I've read things recently and they're really
Let's wipe off the entire left.
misled. But there is also something else that is important to realize, is that these financial expressions of these are financial expressions of something that is a logic that is common and shared to more things. The tension toward the expectation and the trust that the expectation will be met or not is not only financial. When its financial expression can be piracy, can be extremely negative, and can be criticized for the damage they do to the traditional subject. But one should look at this tension as the matter or the logic of sense of the present in outside out, because otherwise it's too easy to criticize it as producing negative effects. And certainly it does produce negative effects. But the logic is broader.
Can I
Sure.
jump in there?
Catherine wanted to say something.
Who did? Oh, Catherine, go on.
I think it's actually covered, but I saw it kind of physically when you said, because you said earlier that the Greek debt is the parousia, right?
Parousia,
That's what
yeah.
you postulated. And when we were talking about Dicky Bow, we were talking, what I saw him trying to do was, in a very awkward way, before he did the performance, try to explain what he did. And it was a language, it was just one way of saying something. And he did it with whatever he brought to it, or like points on an encounter. I started to wonder whether what we're talking about, whether the parousia is different than the parisiac encounter. And in fact, the hope that you have that fascism isn't an end is because of this space, this fractal space, where this encounter is happening, in which these languages, which are all different, whether I'm binary, saying I'm male or female, or we're all, each of us, on a continuum of speaking or understanding or using care or not using care, or buying Greek debt or not buying Greek debt. And that I started to think about whether even that, is it even just a question of the parisic encounter can only exist because the way we can exist as humans is to have a debt towards each other. I'm not talking about the Greek debt, but
Yeah, the debt.
if you help me, I help you, and then we create, and then we're talking about this relationship.
But, okay, this is where this comparison gets really, really wrong, I think. Because basically,
Which comparison?
the Greek debt and the Parisian debt. And I think that's where we're getting into weird territory, because if we're looking now at derivatives and we're looking at that phase, then what is really happening is what these financial instruments allow us to do is abstractly equalize all kinds of risks.
Mm-hmm.
So a good harvest, a famine, a this, a that, like all kinds of things that in the physical
What do you
world.
mean equalize?
Huh?
What do you mean by equalize?
You can bet on a famine as much as you can bet on a harvest. You can always make money, and you can have, you can buy a kind of little portfolio of things that could include all sorts of elements that have to do with, that come from all over, like all the realms of the physical world, and it would make them all comparable. So I could say, well, if there is going to be a drop in the birth rate in Nigeria, then that could square with sort of the price of butter going up in Switzerland. Yeah? These things have absolutely nothing to do with each other and in common with each other.
So you're talking about the equalization as making them into a financial instrument?
No, the financial instrument that allows you to have a derivatives market equalizes all these kinds of risks and possibilities of the future. Yeah? So
I think it just
No.
I don't think it equalises.
It
I think
doesn't-
it makes
it
it
doesn't.
lighter. And
no,
more
it makes them abstractly compatible. It makes them
Yeah, this is
mathematically
a classical
compatible.
criticism of monetarization of capital. This was done by Marx.
No, but
that's
listen,
not what she's saying.
listen to me.
Try it again.
What I'm trying to say is the reason why the financial markets are sort of working, they could be working, but we could all be dying.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? Because they've become so independent from the physical world, because the way that they can reproduce themselves and reproduce value is absolutely, it used to be like, oh, if the harvest is good, then
Things are good.
the share is going to go up of the bread company or something like that. If the harvest is bad, well, the
But-
shares are going to go down.
but not
Now it's
totally
like,
though.
oh, the bread company has bet both on a good and a bad harvest. So each way, this can be equalized out. So what I'm saying is what's happening is we're increasingly, and we're seeing the real effect of this in our physical worlds. We've increasingly created a sort of, or are co-creating, let's say, this kind of derivatives market, which really now can deal with things that in the physical world could never go together. But on that level of the financial abstraction, they are commensurable.
Yes.
So the fallout of that is things like the Greek debt, like an absurd debt on a very small country that can never be repaid, and that is sort of, I mean, like, you know, you're basically, you're seeing that all these kind of, you know, what is it, like, you know, something happens and so much money is wiped off the market that, you know, a whole country will go into a famine for no reason or something. So this is kind of the world we're in right now. So we're kind of
And is it possible to call that world the technosphere? Or just to call it a name? I'm willing to call it a name.
It's sort of, it's called rigged market capitalism.
I mean,
isn't it?
No,
Yeah, absolutely.
But the,
I'm just saying that
Rigged,
whatever,
rigged, like,
whatever,
so it's like
you can call it
Whatever we
algorithmic
call it.
capitalism.
whatever
yeah.
we call it, let's just call it a name. I'm gonna call it the technosphere because that is the name that conjures these things up for me, but you're right, it's the rig. But the reason I'm saying this is because if we turn to the chapter of Foucault on page 64, basically where he's talking about democracy, and he gets into this whole question of the Parisiac moment of a democratic system. Do you remember that part where he's talking about this? And he gets into democracy and he compares democracy with the prince and, you know, what's happening in the aristocratic moment and so that. And he says, well, some of the moves, you know, in a certain situation you do have a Parisiac moment, but in others you don't. What I was trying to what I was trying to throw out on the table, which I think I've managed to do, but I don't know if I've managed to do it very effectively, is that whatever we call this time period we're in now, that thing has its own ethos, by which I'm not saying I am agreeing with it. I'm saying that it has a way of presenting itself as making sense, whatever that making sense is. And that making sense enables certain kinds of truth-tellings to go on. In this case, it's the debt market. And it's what Anya's talking about in terms of how things become bizarrely equalized, so that when the market falls, some group that's not even involved in the market is completely held ransom.
but that's
Oh, no, you don't
Isn't that
agree
the
with
fall
this.
of the
No,
nation?
this is wrong.
It's not
Okay,
true
well-
though.
When the market falls, somebody will gain and somebody will
Right.
will lose. But what it's not got anything to do with is the Greek people or the people who originally lent the money.
That's my point.
But the two things are no longer connected, and that's the derivative or the securitization
right.
and the space of circulation.
But also to
That's
the
right.
There
point
aren't
where
victims. There aren't victims here. The Greek people have received the money, or at least their government has received the money, and probably is then been stolen by the politicians. But I think that is this temptation to kind of look for
I think me
evil.
and Despina have to do a
Look-
special
look-
class
Yeah,
on the Greek death.
I mean,
Let's take it in hand.
It's important to not sort of get the Aunt Sallies of the sort of like the greedy, faceless capitalists, because that
Aunt Sally's, what's that?
Where's
the people who throw stones, who throw rocks at
How do you call them?
an Aunt Sally.
Aunt Sally, yeah.
You call them an Aunt Sally?
So
I
basically,
don't know what that is.
You're gonna have to explain because I don't know what.
So what is an Aunt Sally?
in terms of how I know Aunt Sally was a character from Was the Gummidge, yeah.
From who?
Was the Gummidge, which was a character on British TV, and so basically he fancied Aunt Sally, but then he was getting nothing from her, basically, and then she had all the power
Because she was wood.
because she was wood.
Okay, there's a small detail.
But what
So
I'm
basically,
confused-
the Aunt Sally was things that you and did throw things at.
Yeah, so an Aunt
Opera
Sally
fairs
is
and
a,
all sorts of all, yeah.
is a character in British folkloric
Yeah,
practice
yeah.
performance who's made of wood and
Yes.
you're invited to throw stones at this character
Nice.
At
That-
fairgrounds.
that-
at fairgrounds and Punch and Judy shows,
And not
perhaps.
Campus Fair.
That's what I'm just trying to say.
So,
like,
so
as we
somebody who
just-
receives an unfair amount of hostility and blame
Is an Aunt Sally.
and it's a kind of cathartic practice. So the audience gets to exercise a cathartic moment. Aunt Sally experiences the brunt of this, but she's made of wood, and everybody
Yes.
goes home happy.
So not even human.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
Okay, that was-
thank you for that.
You can watch it on Channel 4. I mean, on
Now, what
YouTube.
is, I believe is very important in this discussion to realize is that all this circulation of death, or all this circulation of one in other times we call them signs, cannot be posed as opposed to material.
Right,
They are both matter.
yes.
And this is why I made a comment about some leftist position at the moment. They don't get this, and therefore they will forever be wrong.
Right.
So the tensions.
So in fact, it's not an Aunt Sally that's going on.
No, the kind of faceless the movement or the price of the debt going up or down, and being manipulated,
Or sold on or whatever.
or sold. It isn't a kind of, there isn't a sort of a victim here. That's just the price of a symbol, the symbol of the thing.
What symbol?
The symbol of the debt, the security. I mean, the security, just like money is a symbol.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the symbol that circulates. So
It's
the
the
Greek
belief.
debt is now securitized, and it also circulates. But the Greek people have nominally already received the money. So this kind of idea that, they're burdened with this incredible and unpayable debt,
But what about deflation?
they have actually received the money. The
I
people
don't
who've lost the
think
money,
That's the case.
well, no, because the politicians stole it. But that's beside the point.
But no, see, here's what I'm trying to say, but obviously I'm failing, so I'm gonna try a whole different approach, because obviously with the capitalist amongst us, I'm hitting raw nerves, so I'm gonna try a whole different approach. So let's circle over to Saudi Arabia. New prince. Whatever his name is, new king, he has now instituted a rule that women can drive.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks for confirming that. It's been-
So we've got that thing done. Now, I think
Clarity.
that the decree that has happened in Saudi is similar to how I'm trying to talk about the Greek debt, in the sense that it is not the women's movement that has set up the righting of the wrongs of driving a car in Saudi. And whether or not this affects women or doesn't affect women is not irrelevant to women, but it hovers over the heads and is passed on as a trading moment, as it were, that enables, in this case, Saudi, to get a better leg up in the world, to be seen as being civilized, because women are now allowed to drive, even though the women who are affected have had very little, if nothing, to say about this thing. And that form of the political materialized move has happened in a circulatory moment of a debt not in the circulatory moment of an oppressive group fighting for rights, and then it's getting acknowledged, and people like then acknowledge the things and go on. It's a different mechanism that's happening, which is why I also brought in the question of the Dickie Bow thing, because I thought what he did, which was interesting, whether or not he was being male or female or whatever the thing was, or with care or not care, what I thought was interesting about the entire 2-hour thing that he did was he was trying to talk about how this ghost, as he started calling it, is to start with, the Hamlet ghost, who goes there, that ghost, when it turns out it's the I who goes there, and the I who goes there is never part of this group, but is always being lip-synced, as it were, it's not being inhabited, it's being synced. And that syncing was the interesting part of this whole thing, whether or not it was the drag queen or what?
No, just sync.
Oh, sync, no, S-Y-N.
So
No,
doesn't
no,
that,
I
so-
understood,
so-
but it also has.
So if the out there, the syncing, the shift of the voice from one
It's just the
Well,
network.
from
It's-
one
it's
part
the
to
economy.
another.
But isn't
Yeah.
it?
But isn't sorry, hang on a second. Doesn't that mean that rather than some parousia, that fiction is what's lubricating the circulation?
And
Yeah.
isn't it then fair to say that fiction is the parousia?
If you want,
Yes, I want.
okay, but you can have it then.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay, this gets into how the markets part could make sense.
Thank you.
But
What
Can
makes
you
sense?
explain why? Can you explain why?
Because
What
the
makes-
markets, the financial markets.
Uh-huh.
So, because the way it works is there's a certain group who are allowed entry, right? And that certain group plays a game of belief in what certain things are worth. Pro or against, it's gonna go up or down. Some people say it's gonna go up, some people say it's gonna go down. They put their money on the same thing, doing different things. But it's on belief and some kind of things around political stuff, around social stuff, around value of materials, around potential value of materials. So it's all around belief of this group of people who have
And expressed by people gambling.
by gambling,
Yes.
You know.
right? And so that's the truth of the financial markets and how they really work. It's belief, which changes, which is why you see these huge crashes based on Trump doing something crazy. It has nothing to do with, how much it costs the farmer to grow the corn.
But it's not
whole
belief, yes.
Yeah, we're in that sort of
It is
algorithmic kind of moment where it's not just, oh, I think the West Indies company will do really, really well because, blah. It's actually, I've heard it from Jonathan at the coffee house, it's actually like
Who's Jonathan at the coffee house?
Well,
I'm glad you're citing your sources here.
It's clearly a financial expert
I'm talking about 18th century financial capitalism, stock market, driven by belief in companies
Right, yeah.
and exploitation and expansion. We're not there anymore, where right now these things get calculated and played against each other by basically algorithmic programs.
Well, no, because they don't.
No.
It
Part of
it's
it
belief.
does.
The belief fluctuates, and
It's
therefore
not
the
what
cost.
drives it. Sorry, it's
No.
beliefs.
Yeah.
But
No, but it's already in a realm where it's no longer within. There might still be a small group of humans that sort of profit and trade in these things, but on the whole,
But it's not.
It's-
It's not relevant that
Wait,
it is
let her finish
mechanized.
this.
It's not relevant that it is
no,
mechanized.
it
or,
is
or
relevant
automatized.
because it goes into a kind of it goes into a realm
mean,
that
there-
has a completely different way of dealing with the physical world and what can be thought in it and how it can be compared. That totally goes beyond what for us in our present embodiment is livable.
You're talking about risk analytics.
I think that was excellent. Yes,
It
yes.
is, but
yes.
only in strict
No, did
financial
it-
terms.
No. Sorry, can you just pull out the political comment then that you're making?
The political comment that I'm making is that I mean, this for me would be the reason why I think it's not the same debt that Foucault is trying to get at.
Okay.
Because Foucault is trying to get at a debt that has really to do with this ethical community of beings, let's say, that they enter into with some degree of autonomy in his case, actually, versus a kind of situation that we're getting into with a kind of debt that is like already beyond human scale, beyond kind of ethical considerations, beyond even a kind of planetary, you know, so,
Yeah.
and I don't know,
Dario, were you gonna say something about
maybe you should
algorithms?
make the political point.
I will make the political point, but you were so close to it that I thought, I will do that, but just one sec.
In what?
So were you gonna say anything about algorithms before Mattia explodes?
Let's first-
And you did it with coffee.
I agree with this argument if you make it about the financial side of that. But precisely because we are, we started, for example, with the death of Stephen Hawking.
Yes.
He,
Death, not death.
Death.
Yeah.
What day?
Stephen Hawking.
Death,
Ah,
he's
yes.
dead.
Yeah.
And the column note on the newspapers this morning was the formula, the equation he wanted on his gravestone, which is the definition of the overall entropy of the universe.
Oh, that's so fucking cool.
But what
Capitalist
He's jealous now, so we should let him wallow all by himself.
That's right, wallow, type of wallow.
the entropy is a dead concept.
Yes, thank you.
But what is very
Can you
interesting,
repeat, please?
entropy is a dead concept.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, precisely because we're now thinking of physics, I was thinking of an example brought up by Isabel Stengers in her Cosmopolitics, where she quotes a diatribe between Max Planck and Otto Mach in 1920-something about the problems generated by quantum physics. And Otto Mach is proposing that we might, like Bohr, we might have to accept that our intervention as an essential part in creating the reality we deal with. And Planck wants to excommunicate Mach from physics, and he insists and writes in a letter to somebody else, I don't remember the name, that the scientist must have faith that there is an object there. Now, this is where it becomes very interesting, because to me, the fact is not that there is an object there. The fact is that I have the faith that there is an object there. And this is precisely the same logic as the derivative.
Yes.
Okay, now I can make the political point, perhaps.
Okay, you can repeat it again. You look so deflated just now. You did this whole thing, and now it's like, okay, that's all good. Yeah, what is it?
The sense is that through this, we're locked into a particular future that is hovering there and that's not there, but there at the same time, which is one version of it that is coming if that is to be honored.
Mm-hmm.
So, does that make sense? If I make a prediction, it will take the Greek public 40 years to pay back 20% of the debt or something, if they cut their pensions completely
And die.
yeah. You know? So, but if they die,
rob them.
I mean,
But
there
we're
is a kind of thing that you have to collaborate in some. I mean, that gets
Do
really
you know
dodgy.
the Dead Souls, the book Dead Souls?
Yeah.
The Russian book, Dead Souls.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so fabulous, because this reminds me of it, because, you know, here the debt is now still being made to be paid off by people who are already dead, but like times 10. And it's not even their ancestors or their offspring or something, they still have to keep paying this debt. I mean, anyway, sorry, that's just the absurdity. So, okay, hang on to that for a second. Let's go back to, can you repeat what you said seconds ago?
Yes.
Okay, about the entropy and how that is a form of a debt, what that means.
Well, entropy is.
Do you remember the equation that Hawkins wants in his gravestone?
S is equal, it has all the three constants, four constants of physics. So there is H, the Planck constants, which is the granularity of quantum physics, the jumps. It has gravity, the Newton constant. It has another constant, which is A, which is the Boltzmann constant, which is the relation between energy and generation of heat. And it is divided by, is it written there, is it? I can't remember it all.
No, I'm trying to make it bigger.
There's actually a mock-up of his gravestone.
Oh, God, really?
No, I'm kidding.
Well done. Well, very well played.
But entropy as the problem that conceives, it works off it in the notion of a totality. Now, it becomes problematic when there is no way to measure and be certain that this is totality there, or a finite universe.
I can't make it bigger, sorry.
Yes, so it is S equal pi times A, which is Boltzmann constant, the conversion of energy in heat. K is Planck constant. C is the speed of light to the cubic power times 3 divided twice H. No, I'm making a mistake here. Divided twice Planck and gravity. We can actually find it out. But what I want to say, it's not a problem with this. What I'm saying is that he comes up with something that describes how the conversion of everything that is becomes time.
Becomes what?
Time.
Okay.
Entropy.
The conversion of everything
that is
becomes
time.
time. Okay.
So there is a depth there in the sense that in classic physics, this would have been conceived as a totality, and it would have been a consumption of energy to the point of exhausting it, and one would have arrived at the end. And that's, one finds it in Hegel is exactly that process, the dialectical becoming aware of the
Of itself, as it were, yeah.
Then there are other instances where if the universe is open or ever expanding, then this boundary at the end is not there, but entropy is nevertheless not recoverable. So this element of death and of passing from one side to the other of the equal sign or the threshold remains. So that already expands the notion of death from a strictly monetary or financial realm to something broader. But then what it becomes interesting is that the tension, the expectation, the trust that would affect the financial instrument is also in this economy of knowledge that is science. And then I brought the example of Planck versus Mach. Mach, they were both quantum physicists, and Mach was, like Bohr, proposing that the intervention of the scientific observation had an essential part, not a fundamental, but an essential part in the generation of reality. So it was accepting indeterminacy as constitutive of matter, nature, universe, whatever one wants to call it. And Planck is horrified by this, finds it an incredible scandal. And Stanley says that Planck wants to excommunicate Mach, really showing the dogmatic stance of Planck. And Planck writes to a friend in a letter that one must have faith that there is an object there to know. And what I add to this description is that the fact is not that there is an object there, but the very statement that there is an object there, the fact that I have faith that there is an object there. This is the dimension I have, this is my matter.
And when you say faith, is that the same as Shannon's belief?
Yeah,
Yeah, in this sense, or is the trust does something with that.
the markets believe,
So
the traders
this
believe.
is a belief up to the 100%.
They make it.
But it's based
But
on
this belief
probability.
comes from a
Yes.
calculation and a certain
Sometimes yes, sometimes
certain
no.
and the certainty.
No.
I'm not. No.
Generally,
Not in the
it's-
markets, no.
but it's based on probability.
It used to be belief in pre-derivative sense. In derivative sense, it's contingent claim. It's not anymore that I believe, and this is propagated into the whole society. Like today, it's not like I promise to do something, but I claim, and it's always this claim and the opposite claim against this claim that kind of surpassing each
Yeah,
other.
but these are three. Adding an explanation to this. In Planck and Mach in this instance are not opposed. They are somehow on the same segment with different values in the same formula. For Planck, the certainty of a reality out there is 100%. For Mach is 5% or 0%, but the formula is the same.
So they're just on the different sides of the market. So if you, going back to your 100%, that the debt is repaid in full and immediately, you used to call that the closure of metaphysics. That's just one side of, that's complete certainty, 100% certainty, and then 0 is complete absence of faith in the symbolic exchange.
Okay, so now.
So it has no value. So
Right.
there's no longer an acceptance that there is the possibility of symbolic exchange.
There's no more market.
There's no more market, and the debt in this case, rather than be repaid, the value of the debt in circulation has reduced to zero. But you're still talking about precisely these two being on the other side, and they're held in tension, and that tension is price. The closer it is to zero, the more
One of them's going to win,
the
the other
more
one's going to
one
win
of
the
them is,
other way.
is prevailing. His or her opinion is prevailing, and they.
So
vice
is
versa.
there a
And if you
difference
think
between
of
that?
these two,
Sorry, go on.
Or is
if you
it
think of these two
exploitation
situations of 100% and 0% as being different two claims, and then connected to price, all these states are basically always priced in this one moment, in present moment where the price comes to be. So they're all. That's why there's.
What do you mean?
Basically, that's why the futures destroy the future, in the sense that no matter whether the future is going to be 0 or 100, all these cases are already priced in today's price. So I cannot-
They balance it.
You're talking
So
about
if they
puts
won't
and
sell
calls.
any more futures, then they have sold non-futures, if you will. There's always an algorithmic balancing.
The algorithm always connects all the underlying, which is the debt, and all possible derivatives. So when I want to say, okay, I want the 0, I believe in 0, I cannot say, okay, this is my belief. I need to see all the claims of all the others and the underlying, and all put all these things into the pricing model to kind of derive today's price of that statement, of my own claim.
And so now Lauren raised the question of location, right? Did I hear that?
no, exploitation.
Oh, exploitation.
It's rather than sort of belief that exploitation prevailing.
Yeah, go on.
So, well, I suppose what I've been thinking is when people speak, I've been thinking about the right to inhabit. So, in that sense, that's what is being robbed. That's what is being exploited.
Yes. And so the question I have then, which is what I thought you were going to talk about, but that's right, is who has this belief? Who has this so-called faith? Is it the faith that Kierkegaard talks about?
But
This was
I
my
think it's important to say
question, yeah, I
that
wanted
the
to-
claims,
Yeah.
the claims are still only around a single proposition, and the single proposition in the case of the Greek debt is the Greek
Yeah.
government will repay the money that it has already borrowed, and that is all. And so the claims, oh yes, I think it will, or I think it will not, which is the tension around the market, is still only about a single proposition, and, you know, and that can be multiplied, whether it's
Millions and
the-
billions of
the
positions.
corn, the supply of corn is going to be finite, or cobalt or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's if there's a kind of truth, it's only which is the competing claims. It is in a sort of silo, and the silo is the proposition. I think it's difficult to then start to generalize across these silos.
But is it possible to think that this thing called the Greek debt isn't like 1,350,000,000,000, kronos or whatever it would be, but in fact, or euros, but in fact, is made up of sort of subprimes and a variety of other things. So when the debt is sold and someone or an entity buys the debt, they don't clear the debt. It's not, if someone buys the debt, they're not clearing off a debt and then, paying back the debt.
No,
They're
of
not
course
buying it. What they're doing is they're transferring the debt.
But if you have bought the debt and you're sitting there and it's sitting in your securities account, then you have bought the right to receive the interest payments or the coupon payments, which the Greek government are or are not making at any one time. So you will then have a chance of having your money repaid. Because
Right.
if you bought the debt, you've exchanged cash for it.
Right, of course.
You
Or
probably
you
use
And
exchange
you will-
something for it.
Yeah, you
might
will
not have
receive, you will
exchanged cash,
receive
yeah.
smaller amounts of cash over time for your...
Or you may not receive cash, you may have actually received stocks.
No, not if you bought the Greek debt. If you bought the Greek debt, you're holding a security. You've paid money for it, and you will receive smaller amounts of money over time, once every quarter, as the Greek government makes interest payments.
Right, and so what is sold on, so
What about the
what's,
derivative?
what?
The derivative?
Yes, the derivative is what's sold, but what's sold on is the debt is sold on. The actual debt is sold on. And so,
But the
The
Greek,
Greeks-
the
the
Greek,
Greeks
the Greek
still
government
owe.
don't have the debt. They have never had the debt. They owe the debt. The debt is with the people who lend them the money in the first place,
right,
and they have then sold it on.
yes.
And they're the people who would have experienced the
Yeah,
loss.
they own the debt in the sense that they are the debtors.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
the
But
debt.
they still owe as much as they
Yes.
did in the beginning.
in the beginning.
But if they
Yeah.
owed it to you and I bought it from you because you didn't want it anymore and they owed you $10, but I only paid you $5, you go just for your $5 and buy something else, they still owe me 10, those
Mhm.
Greeks,
Yeah.
but I only paid 5 for it,
Yeah.
so
That's
you
right.
make twice as much.
But the reason you've only
That's
paid
right.
5 for it is because there's only a 50% probability of getting paid at
Exactly.
all. And so you're speculating on the probability.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So we're on the same page on this.
No, I know, it's just, but it's, but
But
it's,
isn't there the
it's,
absence of
when
nation?
if you say, the Greeks own the debt, they do not.
They own the debt.
No, they don't.
They are responsible
No, they
for
don't.
it.
They're
They-
responsible for
Yeah,
it.
they do not own the
They're
debt.
They owe it.
They
They
own
own
the
Yes,
debt.
They
so
are
the precisely
indebted.
the opposite is the case. They do not own the debt. The Greeks do not own the debt. They have
Oh.
issued the debt, and so they are on the other side of that
They
transaction.
owe it, but
They
They
owe
own
it,
the
but
debt.
they do not own
Okay,
it.
so maybe that's a better way of putting it then. Okay, sorry. So I stand corrected on that side of it. They are the people for whom the debt is in their name. Like, right?
Well, it's
Yeah.
also because.
We're agreeing on that one,
Yeah,
okay?
yeah, yeah.
So when that debt is sold on, it does not affect the fact that the people who owe the debt get anything out of this.
No, the Greeks, only the Greeks in this instance can ever owe to the lenders.
Right,
Who the lenders are is irrelevant to the Greeks. They've received the money and they received 100, and now they've promised to make repayments. Whether the repayment goes to you
yes,
or Catherine, because you've got tired of owning it and
Yeah,
you thought,
so I
oh, God,
gave it
you
to
know,
Catherine or
and, you
sold it
know,
off.
or you've experienced such horrendous losses for your foolishness that you then sold it to Catherine because you can't bear to look at the damn stuff. But you have the piece of paper which is the security.
yes,
The Greeks have got the cash.
yes.
Your
but
cash.
the debt
Yeah,
is still owed
owed by the Greeks.
by the
Yes.
Greeks.
Always, and
That's what I'm
and
saying.
the only thing that they do is repay or not repay according to their whims and capabilities.
Yes,
The
And-
losses,
and that, they can
experienced by
never
you.
repay the debt.
that's reflected in the price. Because that's a belief, whether they will never repay the debt because it's too large, and that belief is reflected in the price.
And so-
That's the $5.
Assuming that the debt cannot be repaid, it just gets transferred
Rolled over.
or rolled over.
Because that's not, getting
Well,
it transferred
okay.
has got
Yes,
nothing
yes,
to
yes,
do
right
with it.
there. Get rolled over.
Yeah.
So the debt gets rolled over. Then the question becomes, how does that entity called the Greek debt go to zero without the Greek people owing it, paying it off?
It gets written off. I mean, the answer is never, or it does not, unless the people who hold the debt now, hold the security, agree that they should write it off,
Right.
which does happen. I mean, not in the Greek case.
You are thinking in a very linear way.
I'm just
But
telling
this
you
is the
how.
way it
I'm just
works.
telling you how it works.
But this is how, no, but
This is how it works.
But this is why I want to push you on this, because, yes, and so then if, I don't know, the World Trade Organization, whoever it is that holds this, cancels the debt,
Cancels the
okay,
debt, right?
then everybody's happy and we go back to zero, as it were.
Correct.
But that is not going to happen in an environment that is, I'm calling the technosphere. It is being called the
It
technosphere.
can
I don't see how you can say that. I mean, that precisely
Is
that
the
has
Sally,
happened.
Aunt Sally thing.
Well, no. I mean,
Whatever it is.
eventually,
Channel that, Sally.
eventually, in the history of
Sally.
countries, well, no, the Greek debt. If you go back a little further, in the 1970s, there was this huge appetite to recycle money that was being made by the exploitation of petroleum in the Arab states, and that money ended up in the Western banking system, and the Western banks had to lend it to somebody, and so they lent it to everybody. And so countries which have extremely poor repayment records and no chance of paying it back, Chad and places like this, will lend phenomenal amounts of money. In the Philippines, and it went on, vast shoe collections or other, it recycled back into private Swiss accounts. And the benighted people of these nations still owed the debt. And because of that, the price of the debt sunk from 100, which was the original price, lower and lower and lower until it would trade at 5 or 10 cents on the dollar. Because as Catherine says, the $10 is still $10 of debt,
Yeah.
regardless of how much
It's worth.
it's been paid
Yes.
for it, because it circulates. And eventually, the debt was so cheap that it was bought by supranational organisations like the World Bank and other institutions, and it was cancelled, because that would then allow countries like Chad, who perhaps had learned from their mistakes and had assassinated their leaders or just voted in new ones, to then re-access markets and borrow again and do it perhaps more considerately.
Okay, yes, now,
No,
was that,
the one other thing.
what'd you say?
I'm just going to explode.
No. Barnaby has so much faith in.
It's not faith. I'm just saying that's what.
The nice word,
that's
faith.
kind of what happened.
But it's not fair, it's not happened.
But the other thing is
I'm not
that,
saying
No, but.
it's not something I believe in. It's just something
No,
that is.
but let's say this is the is.
What is the is, Barnaby?
but can I say one thing is that on top of that, the basic debt transfer, there's a whole other layer of these sort of boutique instruments that are put on top of the speculation. That's much more risky, extremely
Of course,
risky.
yeah, because
Yeah.
they're lighter.
So there's they and that has absolutely nothing to. I mean, it's like so many layers put aside.
But it feels like one thing, especially since we're talking about the Greek debt, it feels like these structures that we're talking about, Greece is a nation, or a nation state.
Yes.
And it was built on a certain level of belief and value and, whatever, as is each nation state. And it's disappeared, that who runs the world has disappeared, that nation state, even though the World Bank can come in and buy something at the end. The sense of belief and value is where parousia might have existed under.
Well, in the situation of Greece, you had greedy and corrupt politicians enabled by criminally reckless and greedy bankers, those lovely people at Goldman Sachs, and incredibly naive investors shepherded by the European community who badly wanted Greece to join them, despite the fact that they failed to qualify under any circumstances. So the people at Goldman Sachs massaged the figures, and incredibly, then Greece looked like a viable member of the club. And so the gullible people lent them lots of money, lots more money,
Right.
which was promptly stolen, and they
Well,
lost it all.
it's bad, but it's not as bad as what happened to mortgages in the U.S.
Anyway, the point is,
yeah.
I mean, I realize that we can do one downsmanship in terms of all this kind of thing, but it's a different exchange of environment that's going on, which is what I'm trying to get at here. And as a result, the political and ethical Parisian moves are different. And that's what I'm trying to refocus on. So if we turn to the chapter, which I forgot what page is on now at this point.
64, I think.
64, yeah.
64.
Just to go with the-
The absence of a place for ethos, this one.
My favorite book, I'm so jealous.
So in this is the, what is this? This is the February, this is the second hour of the February 8th lecture. It gets into this question of what is, how does the parasitic moment work, or does it even work in democracy, in a thing called democracy? And he's not talking about liberalism, he's not talking about economics, he's talking about this, he's mentioned this thing called democracy. So if you, would you mind reading this, Despina, starting where it is important to stress the following point, if you can start there. Page 60, in this text.
64.
64.
And it's the last paragraph of the page. It is important to stress the following point. First, with this development, on the one hand, the criticism of democracy as site of parousia, and on the other, the valorization of monarchy and personal power as site of parousia, you see that parousia is not just, as it was in Euripides, a privilege, the exercise of which is inseparable from the honorable citizen's freedom. Parousia now appears not as a right possessed by a subject, but as a practice whose privileges correlate. Its first point of application is not the city or body of citizens, which has to be persuaded and led by it, but something which is both a partner to which it is addressed and a domain in which it is effective. This partner to which parousia is addressed and this domain in which it is effective is the individual's psyche, soul. First thing, we move from the polis to the psyche as the essential correlate of parousia.
So, I'll just go to the, we just have to finish the three things he's talking about. So the next one?
Yeah.
So this, so he's moved into soul. Is this, my question to you guys, just parenthesis, is this what you, is this what you're thinking about when you talk about faith and belief? I don't know. Go on.
Second, the objective of this truth-telling, of this parousiastic practice now oriented towards the psyche, is now not so much useful advice in this or that particular circumstance, when the citizens are at a loss and are looking for a guide who may enable them to escape danger and be saved, as the formation of a certain way of being, a certain way of doing things, of conducting oneself as an individual. The objective of truth-telling is therefore less the city's salvation than the individual's ethos. Third, this double determination of the psyche as correlate of truth-telling and of ethos as the objective of parousiastic practice means that parousia, while being organized around the principle of truth-telling, now takes shape in a set of operations which enable veridiction to induce transformations in the soul. Shall I continue?
Yeah, we just, yeah, maybe a little bit longer so you get a sense of the soul business.
Singling out this transformation of a parousia considered in terms of its democratic and political effects for the salvation of the city, into a parousia which addresses the psyche of individuals and aims at the formation of their ethos, enables us to grasp two sets of consequences. First, I will very quickly pass over this consequence, which is, as it were, somewhat retrospective. It seems to me that the analysis of this parousia may shed a particular light, in a particular way, on the famous question, traditional in the history of Greek philosophy, at least since the end of the 19th century, let's say since Rhodes, with the works of Snell and Patočka, I don't know if I'm pronounced correctly, of the formation of the Greek notion of psyche, of the progressive delineation and definition of this reality of the psyche. And if it is true that there were many different routes and tracks, many different practices which led to this emergence of the soul as a central problem for philosophy, politics, and morality in 5th century Greek culture, if it is true that many ways led to the emergence and definition of the psyche, it seems to me that amongst all these practices we should accord a place to the exercise of parrhesia, to the crisis and criticism of parrhesia, and to the shift which redirected its practice from the political stage to the interplay of individual relationships, which was what I was saying before. But above all, it seems to me that in trying to recapture something of this transformation of parrhesia and its shift from the institutional view of democracy to the perspective of the individual practice of the formation of ethos, we can see something which has an important bearing on our understanding of some fundamental features of Greek philosophy, and so of Western philosophy. With these shifts and changes in parrhesia, we are confronted with basically 3 realities, or at any rate 3 poles. The pole of aletheia and truth-telling, the pole of politia and government, and finally the pole of what in late Greek texts is called ethopiesis, the formation of ethos or of the subject. Conditions for and forms of truth-telling on the one hand, structures and rules of the politia, that is to say of the organization of relations of power, on the other. And finally, modalities of formation of the ethos, in which the individual constitutes himself as moral subject of his conduct. These are the 3 poles which are both irreducible and irreducibly linked to each other. Aletheia, politia, ethos. The essential irreducibility of these 3 poles, their necessary and mutual relationship, and the structure of the reciprocal appeal of one to the other has underpinned, I believe, the very existence of all philosophical discourse from Greece to the present.
Okay, so let's just take a breather now. Does this clarify where we're going now in the derivatives environment, or does it still seem internal to the discussion?
No, it's only environment.
He's mapping a sort of psychic space, the personal psychic space onto an external or exterior political and ethical space.
I don't know if he's doing that. I think one of the things that's happening here, which I want you to take a look at, is the fact that this thing called a parrhesic move shapeshifts.
Mm-hmm.
It has different
Personas?
not personas, it means something very different. So the question of what is truth is shifting. And he's trying to talk about it in terms of, when he talks about democracy, he's referring to it, well, when we looked at it in chapters beforehand or in lectures that go forward, it's just put to one environment. But in fact, the parrhesic moment is three-sided, as it were. So already it's outside of a dialectical move, it's outside of this typically discursive environment, and he's saying it's got this ethos to it, but what does one really mean? He doesn't mean an empty shelter or empty cup or empty holder, that would be the Platonic move. He means something else by this ethos. He means something else by the political, which he later on calls governmentality. And then he means something else by the soul. Or maybe he does, maybe he just means soul, and Barnaby's given us at least a way in by thinking of it as psychic. I don't know.
But is it I mean, it strikes, it calls my attention here, that is, we uses the special ethos rather than a more easily identifiable meaning as ethics.
Good.
Because ethics already points towards good or wrong, more tends to be towards morality. While here, ethos, I generally dislike using etymologies to explain concepts, but carries with itself something about patterns of behavior, practices. So it does away with essences for what in an essentialist frame of thought would have been recognized as the surplus, the aesthetic, the surplus, that which could be disposed of. Instead, here it becomes constitutive of the subject.
Yes.
And it becomes, I would link, I know I'm not engaging with the other two, the politic and
That's right.
but I think that if I'm discussing or looking at practices, modes of acting, in order to explain how the subject becomes subject, psyche, then rather than saying that these practices express an essence, I'm looking precisely at those dimensions I mentioned earlier, where my expectation of certainty is what defines the reality and me as an observer.
So expectation is very different than faith, isn't it?
Yes,
Or is
but
it?
it is then the overall name or the overall color it takes is faith. But in fact, it has along a pattern of expectation of certainty.
I think expectation is completely something different than faith. When
Well,
you have faith, you don't have any expectation.
I agree, but yes, it's not what I meant here in the sense of faith or not. But the point was that there is a pattern that, or a practice, sticking to this word ethos here, mode of acting, that is repeatable, and that's what
Is key.
is key for the constitution of the subject. And Laura might think that this is where we are developing the notion of virtual, and I would agree with her.
What
You wouldn't agree.
I would
adjective?
agree with her.
What adjective did you use for
With what's
ethos?
inside your head.
I
What
don't think the
are-
virtual relates to the subject.
No, but the
So-
ethos, yes, the repeatable.
No,
Ah,
the virtual
repeatable,
doesn't
you
relate
said.
to the repeatable. It relates to event. That for me, the virtual. Well, it depends which virtuality you was thinking about. To me, like Deleuze's virtue is a more radical aspect. It's not. It's not about like a predetermined.
No, of course not.
Oh, well,
She's not suggesting, he's not suggesting.
oh, sorry. I thought you were saying. I can't remember the word you used now. Sorry, I'm not functioning.
That's okay. Wait, Anna, you haven't said anything. Do you have anything to say at the moment?
Yeah, you said repeatable, so
No, I think nothing specific.
Okay. Despina.
Even though I'm not in the place that Mattia is right now, nevertheless I wanted
Are you sure?
nevertheless I want to say that I sense in what you just said, like with the mode of acting, later on why Michel Foucault is talking about the cynic and the mode de vie and the stylistics of life, and the repetition goes in that as well as something that you practice, and actually you are surface because of that, and you and then the encounter also comes into that, because you are this kind of surface but not by yourself, always with others, and actually through your encounters with others. And in the cynic tradition, we have this displacement from the care of the soul to the care of the self. So it's much more, let's say, towards the body than what we were just reading. But for sure it is totally related, and it's what you said before, Johnny, about this text that shape-shifts the notion of parousia in the sense that, as I have already said, that it's sliding somehow in the text. Like Foucault starts talking about parousia as something that has a kind of political aspect, and how does it operate, if so, in democracy, and in monarchy, if so, and then it goes to Socrates, and then it goes to the Cynics, and then it goes to the Christian tradition, and then again the Christian tradition. We also have the vertical exercise of parousia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What do you mean by vertical?
Do you want me to go there? What Foucault says, at least, is that in the Christian tradition we have for the first time, through the ascetic tradition, for example, as a form of exercising parousia, the faith to God that allows someone, while having a parousiastic moment with God, to exercise parousia in a horizontal way, meaning with others as well.
Okay. So it's a spiritual dimension, the vertical, going up there.
Don't see it literally, but it's totally something, it suggests something different that we didn't see in the Cynic tradition or Socrates.
If parousia is not a constant, and is shifting, isn't this an attempt by Foucault to redeem it from concept,
Yes,
from universality?
yes, absolutely.
I think that's disingenuous.
Why?
Because I believe that he by trying to do that, he has changed the substantive material that he started out into something that is no longer so truth, or is no longer truth. He's turned it into fiction.
We've gotten there before.
But
Yeah.
the problem.
I feel like it's a bit of a deja vu moment.
Sure, but
Yeah, right.
I can't
But
see
he's
that.
not saying
If he
that.
says
He's
truth
not
is
saying
fiction,
that
I
it's fiction. He's not saying it as boldly as that. And he's making an argument that if you get out of a concept, that doesn't mean one can't talk about or in fact inhabit truth. It's just, or to put it slightly differently, is there a way to inhabit truth that doesn't bring in the whole metaphysical garden?
I gotta say, I'm with
Yes.
Dr. Rubinstein on this one.
You think he's still being metaphysical?
Yeah. Or he's,
disingenuous?
or he's talking about something. He's changed the material that
Okay,
he's.
wait, hold on.
was under
Just a
research.
minute, I want to ask a question related
wait,
to
were you
this
gonna-
and that.
Before you ask the question,
I
yeah.
was just going to throw in that by tracing the concept through its different historical moments in Greek history, as he imagines it, all he's showing at that point is that different political systems allow more or less of this
Yes.
kind of conduct and turn it more into a public or more into a private type of practice. So I think that because he's trying to do this relational thing between aletheia, politeia, and parousia, he's just trying to show how these three things go together. So you never just go, oh yeah, like let's just have the truth.
Right.
Because you can't just have the truth. It's like you have to have in a way, in his description at least, you have to have also the political system and the form of
So you're saying
how
you
it's-
can't just have the truth.
Just
You've got to have the
not-
truth
yeah,
and its baggage.
No,
And I think he's just left with
it's
the
just like,
baggage.
no, he's just saying, it's like in certain systems, this truth is effective and can have an effect. In other systems, this truth will be completely not heard, suppressed, turned out, defined as dangerous, whatever. So, blocked, yeah. So if I go to a Nazi and say, oh, by the way, you're not even German or something, that doesn't exist, that will have no effect. Because that particular moment, this truth, even if it's true, doesn't,
I know.
no, it doesn't have an effect within that particular constellation, which is always...
Yeah, but he's destroyed parousia by contingency and the context and...
no, he hasn't destroyed it, he's
I think
just
if you say, well, look,
saying...
it works here, but it doesn't work there.
No,
and
but
it's
that
like,
doesn't mean
you
it
know.
goes, for him, that still doesn't mean it goes away, it just means that it's in...
The dispositif.
It's in
It's
the...
the positioning of
Yes,
how
like
one positioning
how it operates is
Yeah.
dependent not just on itself and whether it's true or not. It has a formal and a governmental
But also, it is true only if it
dimension.
circulates.
Yes.
Say again?
It is true only if it circulates.
Mm.
This is the example you made. If you go to the Nazi series, not Germany, she cannot hear it. Then is a statement that bears no weight. Indeed, it is interesting when Foucault, speaking of the cynic life, brings up the example of altering one's currency. Because it is that the pattern of acting out all the ethical values of the Greek culture, then it is turned around and shows that what I'm doing is acting the pattern. And that's what becomes scandalous, because it is inevitable. One cannot avoid seeing it. It's done in public. And at the same time, it shows that we do not have a psyche or a soul as an essence. We have the configuration of a pattern. And as long as that goes, we exist. If that stops, that's it. There's no longer sense.
Is that pattern being, is that exercise of the pattern what contains the possibility of fascism? And since it doesn't have any substance, then that's why your belief is that we're not going to go there?
Well, we may go there. I also think that we are going
Yeah.
there, actually. No, I just think that it can be resisted, or it can be overthrown, but it may not happen in our lifetime. But I do think that it can happen. Anyway, that's just another stuff. Let me just make a different summary.
No, go ahead.
No, go on.
No, I wanted to say ask two things, but I forgot the second one while we were discussing. Is by any chance this vertical exercise of parousia connected with what the scientist gazes at and has faith to? What you said before?
The one has to have faith that there is an object there to be known.
Yes. Is this, in a sense, a kind of vertical exercise of parousia, or overlaps with it, even if it's not exact? You know, do you see the connection that I'm
the notion of
saying?
faith, as it was used by Planck, is that it is an epistemological, after ontological position, where he is saying even beyond the proof, beyond the problems raised by my measuring tools, I have the certainty that there is something there. But because I have no elements to prove that there is something there, then he has to use the word faith.
Yeah. Do you think that this move, in a sense, overlaps or is somehow related to the vertical exercise of parousia?
Would you ask? No, not in the, no, I wouldn't know. No, probably not.
Do you?
No.
Okay. That was my question.
So just to do a tiny summary, one thing we have on the table is a question of metaphysics, which I think we're kind of, at least if not clear on, everybody's not offended by that particular definition at the moment, which is this totalizing moment where a ground is somehow assumed one way or another, and that therefore presents some kind of essentialist, or can present an essentialist move. Okay, good. the first thing that we have on the table is the question of metaphysics.
Okay.
And that metaphysics always already, the famous thing that you hate, always already implies a ground or some kind of ontological positioning. And therefore can carry with it questions of authenticity, authenticity in the immovable sense. This is something that Foucault is criticizing, that Barnaby first was annoyed with and now has thrown Foucault overboard and is stamping on his grave, doing a small dance. No. But is this question of if something is contingent, the contingency or that which makes it true, that which makes it real, is something that must include circulation, must include what is being called either an economy, or some kind of way in which it moves in the social, political, and ethical realm. And that those are the three sort of points that Foucault is giving anyway, as markers that are not empty shells that need to be filled, but are in fact just elements to how the prasic moment gets established. So it's the moment of Prisia is always already plural, and its plurality has to do with a movement of some kind. It has to do with as opposed to a stasis. So the movement that is brought in by metaphysics still manages to create a form of stasis. Foucault is trying to radicalize that movement and talk about it in terms of governmentality and whatever the various things are, and the soul, which sounds a little bit essence to me, but we haven't quite gotten into that yet. But that's the second thing on the table. That second thing that's on the table has something to do with materiality. Because the material aspect of this parisiac move means that sometimes, as you were saying, is effective and sometimes it's not effective. So sometimes you can have 1 million people on a march and it can matter, and sometimes you can have 1 million people on a march and it doesn't matter. And it's not necessarily because the media did or did not reply to it, or that something happened. So there's some other, or there may be some other economy or circulation that's going on that enables the moment of transfer of some form of being, or some form of truth, some form of existence to happen, which is what I was calling the famous Greek death, which maybe is a terrible way of explaining it, but anyway, it's this way, it's this thing that can get shifted and still remain without shifting at all. You know, so it has this kind of cross moves that go on. Now, that's the third thing, and that's this question I'm raising here about how, if it is true, which is a question mark, but I think it is true, if it is true that different systems bring on different cultural truth, in the same way that different names, artist, philosopher, you know, woman, whatever the thing is, brings on different forms of agency. If this is the case, then it seems to me that if we're in a new world, I'm calling the technosphere, but we can call it whatever we're calling it, some sort of post-capitalist or uber-capitalist, you know, moment, whatever it is. And this is not making a judgment on the system. It's just saying whatever that is called, that thing. Then it seems that there's different forms of Parisiac moves that manifest themselves that can make things shift or not shift. So, for example, to put it in the negative field, I think it is remarkable how Donald Trump manages never to fall apart. And I don't think it's just because he's got like a bunch of people behind him. And on the other hand, I don't think he's like, you know, a wizard or a warlock or something like that. I don't think he's a witch. I don't think he's able to magically conjure up something. But he is able to make certain moves happen irrespective of whatever he says. It's fascinating, actually. I think he's you know, when you don't get totally depressed about it, it's kind of amazing. It's kind of really fascinating how this operates. And it operates because something is happening to enable that form of truth to remain prevalent. And it's not because he's lying, although of course he's lying most of the time. And maybe
the
it's
truth
a,
is fiction thing.
and I was gonna say, maybe it's a fiction, but that isn't quite right, that's too easy in a certain
So
sense.
that's the way the markets work.
What?
Too. It's the market.
Yeah, but they-
It's fiction in the sense that it doesn't hold the kind of truth that, like a metaphysical form of truth might hold, or a 1 + 1, an arithmetic truth might hold, 1 + 1 is 2. But it's closer to event, as Lauren had said earlier. So that form of truth is not untrue, but it's not true either. It is. And it's this is thing that I'm trying to get at, and whether or not the
It's
is,
the making of the is.
it's the making of the is, and whether or not that making of the is always has some form of a prejic moment involved. And I'm not saying it does, I'm throwing it out as a point. It seems to me that Foucault can't have it both ways, or maybe he can, but it seems to me a bit odd that he can make an argument that you have this Parisic moment going on that can put its head up or not put its head up, and then at the same time say that the is can be devoid of the ethical. But maybe not. Maybe an is, when we're talking about a black hole, for example, maybe that form of an is would not have a Parisic moment. This is, I don't know if maybe I jumped too far here, maybe I went too fast.
There are probably in the last few sentences you said, 2 or 3 points that I believe should keep in mind for next week. One is that the opposition fiction-truth is misleading, I think.
Sorry?
The opposition truth-fiction is misleading. Also because Foucault speaks of speaking with truth, not speaking the truth. There isn't a statement that it is true in Parisia. There is a way of speaking that is there. So in that sense, it could be a way of speaking that says something that is not propped up with facts, but nevertheless is thrown into the game in such a way that becomes relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And their fiction and reality are not the right categories to address it. I would go more to the speculation of concepts too. So these two things together open up a very, very different notion of truth as something that exists in circulation, as I talked earlier, and is and materiality to be understood in different terms, and tangible versus intangible matter.
How are we doing? Did everybody hear the last sentence of Mathieu? Did you just phase off into?
I phased off into
Can you say it again, please?
That the one aspect is to avoid the misleading categories of truth versus fiction, and the other one is that once one avoids thinking in those terms, the ease, the logic of sense of the present, and with that materiality will also be possible to be thought outside the tangible and the intangible as matter and something that is not real simply because it is intangible.
He's
We
talking
all
about this in Lajes and Alcibiades, when he compares
Mhm.
the two dialogues, he's exactly precisely making that distinction.
But we also saw that in Barat's work when she's talking about theory and practice as something that is material in both cases.
Yes, but there it's much narrower, and at the same time she tends towards a micro-causality in events that to me doesn't quite step out of the problem. This is stronger in this sense.
I agree with you, to be honest.
Okay, so any
not
last
frightened of
words
these, yeah.
before we all die of heat? Any last words?
We're not meeting next week.
We're not meeting next week. Oh, we're not meeting last week.
That's also true, actually.
No, we weren't here last week.
Yes. Depends which is the big we, Grand Poobah we. Next week is crits.
We're actually not meeting then until
Still
quite a
don't know.
long time until the 11th of April.
Yeah.
So are we finishing the whole of the Courage of Truth until then, or what's the
Well,
idea?
that was the idea, well, an idea was that we were gonna finish the rest of the Courage of Truth by the end of April. And that's also the end of the seminar. And then we go into tutorials. What's the idea? Or we can end the seminar now and go into tutorials in April.
It might be good to have like 3 more sessions.
Yeah,
I'd really
yeah.
like to get into the, like how this relates more to the living currency in terms of the,
Yeah.
like the notion of universal prostitution and integral monstrosity, how that relates to what we're talking about, this sort of debt issue, economy, what's happening now in sort of
Great, let's do it. I'm all for that, yeah, let's do that. Let's have 3 more. I think that, can you get the German edition of Sakimara's work at least?
Yeah, and I can ask her if parts of it have been translated, because I
Okay.
know that she's made translations of certain chapters.
Because I think that would be very helpful.
What's
Yeah.
her name? And yeah, it would be nice to have it. What's her name?
I'll send it to you.
Please.
Like, yeah, I send you like a little translation and a link, and I see what I can get from
Also, you
her.
remember that conference, that mad conference we were at?
Yeah.
I have the opening addresses of both Kirsten's thing and also of Julia Reventag's talk.
Yeah.
And one was against speculative realism and the other one, this was a couple of years ago, so she was laying out the general thing, but it's a, I'll put it on the Entanglement folder.
Yeah,
so
but
people
she
can-
would probably say that she's somewhere else already.
I'm sure she would say that, yeah. Maybe I'll put hers on there. Maybe I'll just put Julia's on there. Yeah,
Juliana, yeah.
Juliana, that's what I meant, yeah.
I'll be in Vienna in April at some point when Martin confirms.
Yay. Well, Martin's gonna come here as well.
Oh, fantastic. So
Yeah.
hopefully we won't.
Yeah, you will kiss each other, yeah, that's fine.
Can we?
There's a
because we
party
have
as
to s-
well.
Yeah.
When's the party?
Next Thursday night.
Next Thursday night.
When we're submitting these, before we submit these texts, obviously we will be sending those to you, like the 6,000 or 10,000 words, whatever.
Yep,
So
if
that
you want.
that can be like this virtual tutorial. Okay.
Great. Yeah, that's fine. Everybody handed in their RMC, they needed to hand in the RMC thing. Excellent, well done.
And just coming into human interest, somebody told me yesterday that Koenig Books on Charing Cross is closing, the publisher,
Really?
and they're selling all the books at half price.
Hmm.
The publisher's closing and the bookstore's closing.
Oh, that's a
So
shame.
also in Senate.
Yeah, König, Walter König, no.
Well, she told me that was the store was on Charing Cross. Road.
Not possible.
Not possible, that's
That would
right.
shield Germany in new
Yeah, but it
direction.
costs too much.
So, yeah,
Alright.
I just realized, so we're not, I switched this up.
Yeah, all good.
So since we're not like really